For 7 years, Abigail gave up her own dreams to support the family that claimed to love her. 7 years of monthly wire transfers, paid bills, and resolved emergencies, all without a single complaint, all without questioning a thing. But when the request came that nobody in their right mind would dare to make, something inside her finally broke in a way that couldn't be fixed. And it was that absurd demand that made her close the Bank of Abigail for good. But before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We love knowing how far our stories are reaching. Abigail was 35 when she realized she had become invisible to her own family. Not in the literal sense, of course. Everyone saw her. Everyone knew her by name, knew where she lived, knew her cell phone number, and, most importantly, knew the average balance of her bank account. That was exactly what mattered to them. She was a seamstress, but not the kind who patched up jeans behind a dusty counter in a dying strip mall. Abigail had her own design studio in downtown Chicago, a space she had built from scratch after years of working for other people, first as an assistant in a garment factory, then as a freelance tailor, and later as a pattern maker for a small boutique brand that went bankrupt when she was 26. With her severance pay, she rented a tiny 130-square-foot room, bought 2 used sewing machines, and started out on her own. She knew how to cut, pattern, and create. She knew how to turn fabric into something that made a woman feel beautiful on an important day. And when the studio finally started making real money, when the orders started rolling in regularly and her name began circulating among weddings, graduations, and corporate events all over Chicago, her family woke up to a new reality: Abigail was thriving. It all started naturally, the way these things usually do, slowly and without any big announcements. Her mother, Martha, was going through a tough time after Abigail's father, Arthur, retired and his Social Security checks turned out to be lower than they expected. Their plan had been different. They had counted on a higher amount, relying on a few more years of contributions, but things hadn't worked out as planned. Suddenly, there was a hole in their budget that they couldn't close. Abigail started sending a little help every month, something that felt temporary, a loving gesture from a daughter to her mother. Then her older brother, Matthew, lost his job at a manufacturing plant in downstate Illinois and asked for a loan to cover his rent for the month. Abigail helped without a second thought, because that's what you did when family needed it. And then there was Vanessa, her middle sister. Vanessa was 43, lived in Rockford, Illinois, with her teenage daughter, Chloe, and was emerging from a marriage that had taken 10 years to completely fall apart. When the divorce was finalized, Vanessa kept the house she lived in, which had been left to the sisters by their grandma Eleanor, a woman who had worked her whole life and saved everything she could in a standard savings account. Abigail got the cash their grandmother had saved over the decades, which served as the seed money for her studio. At the time, the split seemed fair to everyone. Vanessa got the real estate, Abigail got the capital. Each got what they needed. The studio grew. Vanessa kept living in their grandmother's house. And Abigail, without anyone officially asking, slowly became the financial backbone of the family. It wasn't a decision made at a family meeting with an agenda and minutes. There was no conversation, no contract, no explicit agreement. It just happened, silently and gradually, the same way the tide rolls in without warning, until you realize the water is up to your neck. One month, she paid her parents' electric bill because things were tight with an unexpected expense. The next month, she sent money to Vanessa to cover a credit card that she had maxed out during a difficult month. Then came the repairs for Matthew's car, which had broken down on the interstate and cost more than he had. Chloe's bus passes to get to school. The blood pressure medication Arthur had to start taking. Her mother's new refrigerator, because the old one died during a brutal summer heat wave and couldn't be fixed. The winter coats she had bought for Chloe 2 years prior because Vanessa said she was broke that month. The remodel of her parents' bathroom, which had been dealing with a plumbing leak for years. And so it went. Month after month. Year after year. Without anyone asking for a review, without anyone asking if Abigail was actually managing to sustain it all, without anyone considering that there might be a limit to what she could give without compromising her own future. For 7 years, Abigail reliably transferred $2,000 a month to her parents. To Vanessa, $1,800 a month. Not counting the extras, which were never in short supply and over time had stopped being emergencies and simply became a constant expectation. If she was doing well, the money was there. If the money was there, there was always a bill to pay or a need to fulfill. The final number, when she finally added it all up that December night, with her bank statements spread out on the table and a pen in her hand, was close to $320,000 over the course of 7 years. She stared at that number for a length of time she couldn't measure. $320,000 that could have been a larger studio, a real safety net, an investment portfolio working for her while she worked for her clients. Instead, it had been handed out in monthly installments to people who, at the end of the day, called her cheap in front of the entire family. But that reckoning was still in the future. Before that, there was Christmas. And that Christmas, there was a conversation that Abigail completely underestimated. The holiday gathering always happened at Abigail's parents' house in Galena, Illinois, a picturesque historic town about 3 hours away from Chicago. It was one of those houses that gathered memories in every corner, with a dining table that needed sawhorses and plywood to fit everyone, folding chairs borrowed from the usual neighbors, and the smell of roasting meat hitting you before you even walked through the door. Abigail had grown up within those walls, and there was still something about that environment that made her relax in a way she couldn't anywhere else. She arrived early, helped set the table, chatted with cousins she only saw on these occasions, and caught up with an aunt who had just flown in from out of state. She felt good. She was genuinely relaxed, the weight of the year fading away and a feeling that there was a lot to celebrate. That was when Vanessa pulled her aside near the living room window, while the rest of the family was being loud in the background, talking and laughing. Her sister had a smile on her face, but it was a smile Abigail couldn't quite read at the time. Only later would she understand it was the expression of someone who had already decided what they wanted before formulating the question, someone communicating a decision disguised as a conversation. Vanessa said Chloe was turning 18 in March. That she was graduating high school this year. That she deserved an unforgettable birthday, something that truly marked her transition into adulthood, because you only turn 18 once. Chloe had been a good daughter, a good student, had been through a lot because of the divorce, and deserved to feel that her family was there for her. Abigail nodded, because it was only natural to agree. Every daughter deserved to be celebrated on a milestone birthday like that. Then Vanessa said she would send over some information later for Abigail to look over carefully. That it would be good to use the holidays to think about it, away from the daily grind. And before Abigail could ask what exactly she meant by look over, Vanessa was already on the other side of the room, pouring sodas for their nephews as if the conversation had never happened. Christmas passed with its usual warmth, with a full table and family stories bouncing from one end to the other. New Year's came with fireworks and resolutions. Abigail went back to Chicago, to the studio, to the backlog of orders, to the clients who needed urgent alterations for January galas. The conversation with Vanessa was forgotten somewhere in the back of her mind, buried under the fast pace of the new year. Until the email arrived. It was a regular Tuesday in February. Abigail was at the studio, hyper-focused on the details of a wedding dress meant for a ceremony that weekend, the embroidered sleeve halfway done, the thread carefully weaving through tiny stitches. When she unlocked her phone to check her messages, she saw an email from Vanessa in her inbox. No greeting, no introductory text, not a single word of explanation. Just a series of links. Abigail clicked the first one. Then the second. Then she went through the rest with a growing, sinking feeling that something was very wrong with what she was seeing. They were real estate listings. Condos for sale in Rockford and Chicago. Prices ranging from $300,000 to $800,000. Some were 2 bedrooms, some larger, some in downtown areas, others in upscale neighborhoods. A carefully curated selection on Zillow, as if someone had spent hours researching the options. Abigail stared at the screen, confused. She thought it was a mistake. That Vanessa had sent it to the wrong person, that she was looking at properties for herself or someone else and just misclicked. She called her sister as soon as she had a moment alone between fittings, and that was when she realized there was no mistake at all. Vanessa wanted Abigail to buy a condo for Chloe as an 18th birthday present. She said it with such a casual tone that it left Abigail speechless for several seconds. She explained that Chloe was going off to college, that she would need a place to live away from home, that real estate was an investment, not an expense, that it would appreciate over time, that Abigail had the financial means to do it without making huge sacrifices, and that it was the perfect gift for such a monumental milestone. She said all of this in the tone of someone suggesting her sister consider buying a slightly nicer gift card than planned, not someone asking for a piece of real estate worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Abigail listened to it all. She waited for her sister to finish. And then she said, with a calm that came from somewhere deep and almost frightening inside her, that it wasn't going to happen. That she was not going to buy real estate for an 18-year-old girl as a birthday gift. That the request was completely out of line and she was shocked Vanessa had even considered it a real possibility. Vanessa's tone changed instantly. It turned cold, heavy with a resentment that felt more rehearsed than genuine, as if she had prepped this exact reaction just in case Abigail didn't immediately agree. She told Abigail that she had never faced any real hardships, that she didn't know what it was like to raise a daughter alone after a messy divorce, that the family had always supported the studio in the hard times, and that it was time to give back a little of what she had received. Abigail didn't reply. She hung up the phone, placed it on her cutting table, and stared at the wedding dress in her hands. She picked up her needle and kept sewing, because sometimes that's what you do when the world around you turns absurd. You pick up whatever is in your hands and you keep going. In the days following the phone call, Abigail tried not to let the issue take up too much space in her head. She shrugged it off a few times, telling herself Vanessa had just overreached and that it would all blow over before Chloe's birthday. But as March rolled around, she knew she needed to decide what to get her niece. She couldn't show up to the party empty-handed, regardless of what had happened between her and Vanessa. She thought carefully for a few days. Chloe was heading to college, she would need practical things that would last. She researched, compared, and decided on a MacBook. A high-end model, fast processor, plenty of memory for any academic need, the kind of equipment that lasts for years without issues and that a college student would use every single day. She paid almost $1,500 for it, an amount that made her swallow hard, but it felt like exactly the right gift for this chapter of Chloe's life. The party was held in Rockford, at the house where Vanessa and Chloe lived. Abigail arrived on time with the wrapped gift in the back seat of her SUV, parked on the brick-paved street in front of the house, and sat there for a moment before getting out. She took a deep breath, preparing herself for whatever the mood of the day might bring. The house was decorated with balloons and colorful banners, there was a huge cake in the kitchen, and a long table loaded with food in the living room. The relatives had arrived before her, aunts, uncles, a few cousins, and Abigail's parents in their usual spots on the sofa. Martha was wearing the necklace Abigail had given her for Mother's Day 2 years ago. Arthur was wearing the watch she had bought for his birthday. Matthew was in the corner with a beer in his hand, chatting with a brother-in-law. On the surface, everything looked perfectly normal. Chloe was happily greeting people, wearing a new dress, smiling for the photos her relatives were snapping on their phones. She was a beautiful girl with an easy smile, and Abigail watched her for a few minutes before walking over to say hello. There was something about the way Chloe occasionally exchanged glances with her mother that Abigail noticed, but didn't quite understand yet. Only later would she realize what it meant. When it was time for presents, everyone gathered in the living room. Abigail's parents went first, handing Chloe the latest iPhone, a generous gift that made the girl let out a genuine squeal of excitement. Everyone laughed. Matthew and his wife gave her a gift card to her favorite clothing store, a reasonable amount that Chloe accepted happily. Vanessa handed her daughter an envelope of cash, announcing the amount out loud with the visible pride of someone who had made a real effort to scrape that money together, and everyone clapped warmly. Then it was Abigail's turn. She placed the wrapped box in Chloe's hands with a genuine smile, saying she hoped it would be useful for college, that she had picked it out with care. Chloe tore the paper with the specific rush of someone used to opening gifts in front of an audience, opened the box, and her smile vanished. It wasn't a subtle or gradual change. It was an immediate, visible transformation, like a window suddenly slamming shut in the middle of a nice breeze. Chloe's face completely dropped. She looked at the laptop box, looked at her mother, and it was in that shared glance between the two of them that Abigail clearly understood what had happened. This had been a setup. Chloe knew what was supposed to be in that box. The disappointment wasn't spontaneous, it was the result of expectations carefully built by someone who had promised her something that wasn't theirs to promise. Vanessa didn't wait a single minute to act. With a voice loud enough to reach every corner of the room, she announced that Abigail was being a cheapskate, that a laptop was a pathetic gift coming from someone who had what she had, that the two of them had talked about this at Christmas and Abigail had agreed to the gift they had settled on. Abigail fired back that she hadn't agreed to absolutely anything, that no promises had been made, that a vague conversation about wanting something special wasn't a legally binding contract, and that buying real estate wasn't a birthday present. It was an absurd demand that shouldn't have crossed anyone's mind to begin with. The fight was fast, ugly, and entirely public. Vanessa raised her voice even louder. Chloe started crying with an intensity that Abigail recognized as partially theatrical, the kind of crying born from anger and embarrassment, not actual pain. Martha took her oldest daughter's side just like she had her entire life, refusing to hear the other perspective. And Arthur looked at Abigail with an expression she had known since childhood, the look of a man who has already decided she is wrong before considering a single argument she might have. Abigail stood frozen for a few seconds in the room that had been, for years, the place she felt most at home. She looked down at the laptop box, which had fallen to the floor when Chloe dropped it in a gesture of absolute disdain. She bent down, picked up the box, hugged it against her chest with both hands, and walked out without another word. She didn't wait for anyone to try and stop her. She walked to her car, tossed the gift onto the passenger seat, and drove all the way back to Chicago with white knuckles on the steering wheel and a strange noise rattling in her chest, like something that had been compressed for way too long had finally given way, and there was no going back. That night, Abigail didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen island of her Chicago apartment with her bank statements from the last 7 years spread out in front of her, a pen, and a lined notebook, and she started doing the math. $2,000 a month to her parents, for 7 full years. $1,800 a month to Vanessa, for those same 7 years. That alone produced a number that made her freeze with her pen hovering in the air for a moment, as if her brain needed an extra second to process what her eyes were seeing. Then she added up the extras with the meticulous care of someone doing this math for the first and very last time. Her mother's fridge that cost over $1,500. Matthew's car repairs, around $2,500. Chloe's transit passes over 2 years. Her dad's medication when he forgot to renew his prescription and had to pay out of pocket at a private pharmacy. Chloe's winter coats. The bathroom remodel that ran $12,000 and that she had entirely bankrolled without anyone explicitly asking or thanking her. The final number hovered right around $320,000. She stared at that number written on the notebook paper for a long, long time. $320,000. She had handed that over across 7 years to people who, that very afternoon in Rockford, had called her a cheapskate in front of the whole family for refusing to buy an apartment. The math didn't add up in any universe that made sense. She opened her mobile banking app at 2 a.m. and canceled the recurring transfers with a calmness she didn't expect to feel. First her parents. Then Vanessa's. 2 taps that represented the closure of 7 years of a dynamic that had ballooned without her even realizing its size. She took screenshots of the cancellation confirmations, opened the family group chat on iMessage, which usually sat dead for days before exploding with good morning memes and photos of nieces and nephews, and typed a short, direct text. The monthly transfers were cancelled, and she was asking them not to contact her. She hit send, muted her phone, and went to bed. In the morning, when she checked her phone, there were 43 texts and 16 missed calls. Her mother had sent a wall of text that swung wildly between begging and accusing at a dizzying speed. Her father, who rarely ever texted in that group, had sent 3 short, harsh messages saying she was betraying the people who raised her. Matthew asked if she had completely lost her mind. And Vanessa had typed out a novel that Abigail didn't even finish reading, because the first few lines already contained words she preferred not to carry with her right before opening the studio. She replied exactly once, to the whole group, "I want no contact, period." Then she blocked their numbers and went to work. The studio was her salvation in the weeks that followed. There was so much to do, clients with scheduled fittings, pieces in various stages of completion, a small capsule collection she was designing for a local boutique that had tracked her down after seeing her work at a wedding. Abigail threw herself into it with an intensity that doubled as a way to avoid sitting still with her own thoughts. But when the noise of the studio finally stopped, when her team went home and she was left alone finishing the last stitches of the day, the silence had a different texture than before. It was lighter. In a way that took her time to name, it was more honest. 2 days after Chloe's birthday party, right in the middle of the studio's busy lunch hour rush, Abigail heard the chime of the glass front door ring with an insistence that definitely wasn't a client. She looked up and saw Vanessa standing outside. With their parents. And with Matthew. All of them together, faces locked in grim expressions, like a delegation that had rehearsed their exact moves before arriving. They walked in uninvited. Vanessa spoke first, using the voice of someone who had prepared a speech, saying that this needed to be resolved right then and there, that the family couldn't stay like this, that Abigail was overreacting, and that an argument at a birthday party didn't justify pulling the plug on everything. Abigail heard the hum of the sewing machine stop. She felt the silence settle over the space where the constant hum of work usually lived. She felt the eyes of her staff on her, on all of them, watching this scene unfold in the middle of her studio on a Friday afternoon. She didn't respond. She looked at Brenda, her most senior employee, and said with a calmness that surprised everyone in the room, herself included, to call building security. And she stated that, as of that day, none of those people were allowed on the premises. Vanessa yelled something as the security guard appeared. Martha wailed that this was a humiliation for the family. Arthur's face turned bright red. Matthew lingered near the door looking like he wasn't entirely sure why he had tagged along in the first place. But they left. When the glass door clicked shut behind them, Abigail walked back to her cutting table, picked up the piece she was working on, and picked up exactly where she had left off. The months that followed were, simultaneously, the loneliest and the freest Abigail had experienced since opening her business. It was a combination of isolation and liberty she hadn't expected to feel together, arriving all mixed up, making it hard sometimes to tell one from the other. Lonely because the silence of an estranged family carries a different weight than normal silence. It's not a neutral, peaceful quiet, it's a silence with texture and temperature, one that sometimes wakes you up at 3 a.m. and makes you wonder if you made the right call, if there was another way, if you could have said things differently. Abigail had many of those moments, especially on Sunday nights, which had always been the time she called her mom for a pointless chat about the week, the weather, or some TV show they were both watching. But free because, for the first time in 7 years, the $3,800 that used to automatically drain from her account on the first of the month just stayed there. It stayed and piled up at a rhythm she wasn't used to seeing. Abigail, who had learned to manage her business finances with strict discipline, opened a separate savings account and transferred that exact amount there every month, as if she were still sending it to her family, but now she was paying herself. In 6 months, she built a safety net she had never managed to achieve before, not for lack of discipline, but simply for lack of actual leftover cash. The studio exploded during this time in a way she never expected to see so quickly. With her brain no longer split between the demands of the business and the manufactured crises of her relatives, and with all the energy that used to go toward managing family emergencies now fully channeled into her work, Abigail noticed opportunities she had previously let slip by. She secured a massive contract with a network of high-end hair salons to supply custom uniforms, a recurring, steady job that guaranteed reliable revenue every month. She started offering premium bridal packages that included styling for bridesmaids and the mothers of the bride and groom. She hired another seamstress specializing in embroidery to keep up with the volume. By July, she started eyeing the vacant commercial space next door to her studio. She talked to the landlord, negotiated, and signed an expansion lease. The dividing wall would come down, the new space would be integrated, and brand new workstations would be installed. Life took on a different kind of lightness that she didn't quite know how to label. It wasn't pure happiness exactly, at least not 24/7, not with that extreme intensity people sometimes imagine you feel when you solve a massive problem. There were days of genuine longing, days when she walked past a boutique window and thought her mom would love that blouse, days when she saw a big family eating at a restaurant on a Sunday afternoon and felt a sharp pang in her chest that took a few minutes to pass before her breathing returned to normal. But there were also days when she woke up in the morning without any invisible weight crushing her shoulders. Without the dull, humming anxiety of someone constantly waiting for the next request to drop, the next emergency to pop up, the next crisis that only she could fix. It was on a Tuesday in August when she saw the photos on social media. A cousin had posted pictures from Chloe's high school graduation, the ceremony, the diploma, the family huddled together in front of the football field for the standard photo op. Abigail stopped scrolling to look closely. Chloe was smiling in the pictures, but it was a forced, obligatory smile, the kind you plaster on for the camera because the situation demands it. Vanessa stood next to her daughter with an expression Abigail knew all too well, the face of someone holding it together with considerable effort. Her parents looked tired in a way that went beyond the physical exhaustion of a long ceremony on a hot afternoon. Abigail stared at the images for a long time, then closed the app without commenting. She didn't feel guilty. She felt something closer to a quiet sorrow, a sadness that required absolutely zero action on her part, that was simply allowed to exist and fade away. 3 weeks after those photos were posted, Chloe showed up at the studio. She was alone, without her mother, and hadn't called ahead. She was wearing simple, practical clothes, completely different from the designer labels Abigail used to buy for her over the years. She looked older than the girl at the birthday party, not in a concerning way, but in a way that suggested some hard, important lessons had been learned in the gap between March and August. She asked the receptionist if she could speak with Abigail. She was led into the fitting room, which happened to be empty at the time. They sat down on the low velvet chairs usually reserved for clients, and Chloe stared at her own hands for a solid minute before she started talking. She said she had acted in a way she was deeply ashamed of. She wasn't vague about it, she was specific, naming exactly what she had done. She had been conditioned to expect a gift that was entirely unreasonable to expect, and when she didn't get it, she had reacted in a childish, public way that wasn't fair. She said it had taken her months to come here and say this because it took her time to unlearn the narrative and realize that she was the one at fault, not Abigail. She also mentioned that she had gotten accepted into a state university with a partial scholarship based on merit, that she was splitting a dorm room with another student to save on housing, and that she had landed a part-time job at a local office near campus working Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday afternoons. Abigail listened to all of it without interrupting. When Chloe finished, a brief but heavy silence settled between them. Then Abigail said that she accepted her apology. That she was truly happy to hear her niece was getting her life together on her own terms. And that this, more than any piece of real estate, was something that actually mattered. After Chloe's visit, Abigail spent a few days thinking about what she had witnessed in that conversation. Not about walking back any of her boundaries, but about what the shift in her niece really meant. There was something authentic there, a transformation that seemed to have come at a real personal cost. This wasn't the girl who had sneered and dropped a MacBook on the floor. This was someone else, or at least a highly upgraded version of the same person. After thinking it over, she called Chloe and told her she was going to send a monthly allowance to help cover some college expenses, books, groceries, train tickets, but on one strict, non-negotiable condition: this stayed completely between the two of them. Not a single word to Vanessa, to her grandparents, to Matthew, to anyone in the family. If the information leaked, the money stopped instantly. Chloe agreed without hesitation. The transfers started quietly, through Zelle, every 15th of the month, with zero fanfare. Abigail sent it. Chloe texted a quick thank you the same day. Once a month, sometimes more frequently during midterms, Chloe would text an update on how she was doing, a high grade in a brutal class, a win at her part-time job, just small, concrete news about her daily life. It was a simple, honest exchange, totally stripped of the historical baggage, free from the toxic debtor and collector dynamic. It was, Abigail realized, the very first family relationship she had ever built purely on respect, rather than dependency. November arrived with the studio in full expansion mode. The dividing wall was gone and the new floor plan had been completely renovated, fresh paint, upgraded lighting, sleek new cutting tables, and custom shelving for the imported fabrics. 3 brand new industrial sewing machines had been delivered and set up by the supplier's team. Abigail had hired 2 more seamstresses and an administrative assistant to handle booking, invoices, and daily finances, finally freeing Abigail to focus entirely on what she did best. She was organizing bolts of new silk in the stockroom on a Thursday afternoon when Chloe called. Her voice sounded different, a tight wire of tension that Abigail picked up on before her niece even formed a sentence. Chloe had gone home to her mom's house the previous weekend. Vanessa had seen a Venmo push notification pop up on her daughter's phone screen. She had demanded to know what it was, and Chloe told the truth because she couldn't bring herself to look her mother in the eye and lie. Abigail closed her eyes for a split second. She calmly asked what happened next. Vanessa had gone ballistic. She screamed that it was unfair for Abigail to bankroll her niece while cutting off her own sister. Chloe's grandparents found out too, and the atmosphere in the house had been toxic for days. Chloe was calling to confess, not to ask Abigail to stop. In fact, she practically begged her not to stop. She said the allowance made a massive difference in her survival, that she was able to comfortably pay her bills because of it, and that she had learned to budget every dollar carefully. Abigail told Chloe that none of this was her fault, that the financial help wasn't going to stop, but that there would definitely be fallout. The fallout arrived on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks later, in the form of a doorbell buzzing at Abigail's apartment with an urgency that clearly wasn't FedEx or a neighbor. When she checked the window before opening the door, she saw Vanessa standing on the sidewalk, alone. No parents, no Chloe. Abigail watched her sister for a moment before walking down and unlocking the door. Vanessa had her winter coat zipped all the way up to her chin, her hands gripping her purse straps so tightly it looked like a conscious effort to keep from shaking, like she needed an anchor while she waited. What Abigail saw on her sister's face was entirely different from anything she had ever seen before. The entitlement of the last few years was gone. The venom from the birthday party was gone. The icy calculation of the real estate email was gone. All that was left was sheer exhaustion. And buried just beneath that exhaustion, something it took Abigail a second to properly identify: deep, burning shame. Abigail opened the door but didn't invite her inside. She stood on the threshold, waiting. Vanessa started speaking slowly, her voice stripped of the authoritative edge she always used when dealing with Abigail. She said she knew she had been entirely in the wrong. And she was specific, itemizing every single offense. The condo demand had been delusional, the tantrum at the party had been humiliating, and storming the studio had been a massive mistake that she deeply regretted. She said she had spent months trying to convince herself that Abigail was the villain in the story, finding new ways every week to prop up that fantasy, until eventually, she just couldn't force herself to believe it anymore. She said she had started looking at her own life with more brutal honesty than she had managed in decades. She had realized, with Chloe's unintentional help, that she had used Abigail's generosity as a load-bearing pillar, leaning all her weight against it without ever considering how heavy it was. She had confused her sister's availability with obligation, treating her bank account like a public utility that everyone had the right to tap into without ever saying thank you. She mentioned that she was now working full-time at a hardware store. She admitted it wasn't her dream job, but it paid the bills, and she had learned to find her dignity in it again. Her parents had also gone back to work, Arthur doing handyman jobs and carpentry for the neighbors, Martha teaching knitting and embroidery twice a week at their local church. She said she didn't come here to ask for a single dime. And she said it in a way that made Abigail actually believe her. A silence fell between them that lasted for several seconds, carrying a totally different frequency than the silence of the last 9 months. This was a silence full of possibility, not hostility. Vanessa looked down at her boots for a second, then added one last thing: she had sat down and talked with Chloe. She had told her daughter that the condo idea was 100% hers, that she had pitched it to Chloe as a done deal, acting like Abigail had already signed off on it. She had explicitly told her daughter that she had absolutely no right to demand anything from her aunt, and that if she ever wanted to make things right, it had to start with showing Abigail respect. Abigail had not expected to hear that. She took a deep breath and answered honestly. She thanked Vanessa for saying it. She admitted she believed her far more than she ever thought she would. She made it clear that you can't just hit a reset button on 7 years of toxic dysfunction with a single conversation on a sidewalk, but that she heard her, and that there was something real in her words. Vanessa nodded. She didn't try to force a hug. She didn't try to rush the fragile thing that was just barely starting to form. She said she understood, that she accepted whatever timeline Abigail needed, and she turned and walked down the sidewalk exactly the way she had come. When Abigail shut the door and stood in the hallway for a few minutes, she felt an emotion that took time to accurately define. It wasn't total forgiveness yet, at least not the kind of absolute pardon that wipes the slate clean forever. It was the birth of a possibility. A tiny crack of light where a solid brick wall used to be. Abigail spent Christmas in Chicago that year, for the first time in her adult life. She had always, without fail, driven out to Galena for the holidays, even in the years when her studio was drowning in rush orders and she had to leave the city at the crack of dawn on Christmas Eve just to make it. It was a habit that had morphed into an unwritten law, the kind nobody says out loud but everyone blindly obeys. But this December, she stayed put. She hosted a dinner party in the newly expanded studio for her staff and a few friends who were also stranded in the city for the holidays. It was a simple dinner, great food, lo-fi music in the background, and conversations that carried no hidden agendas or emotional demands. There was a specific vibe to that night that Abigail couldn't name at the time, but fully recognized later. It was the feeling of a celebration that didn't cost her her soul. Nobody needed anything from her except her company and the roast she had cooked alongside her oldest seamstresses. She texted Chloe to wish her a Merry Christmas. She got a fast reply with a photo of her niece in her cramped dorm room with her roommate, both wearing cheap Santa hats with a string of fairy lights taped to the window, smiling with a lightness that Abigail instantly recognized as real. She didn't text Vanessa or her parents. But she also didn't feel that sharp twist of guilt she had fully expected to feel. There was a type of peace in that silence that was completely different from the heavy, suffocating silence of the early months after Chloe's birthday disaster. It was a silence that had finally found its own equilibrium. In January, the second wing of the studio officially opened. The grand opening was held on a Saturday afternoon, doors wide open for clients, vendors, partners, and friends. Abigail had organized a classy but understated cocktail hour, white floral arrangements on the cutting tables, the brand new machines lined up and gleaming against the back wall, swatches of the most luxurious imported silks displayed on the custom shelving she had picked out and painted herself. She had just sent out casual text invites and hadn't expected a massive turnout. But far more people showed up than she ever imagined. Fabric vendors she had worked with for years, brides who had recommended the studio to their friends and came personally to congratulate her, the boutique owner she had signed the capsule collection contract with, and 2 recent brides who dropped by just to show off their wedding photos. There was a steady hum of laughter and chatter filling the new space in a way that made Abigail stop in the corner for a second, just to take it all in. She had built this. By herself, through grinding hard work, through brutal choices, at the cost of some losses that still stung on certain days. But she had done it through the slow, sometimes agonizing realization that generosity must have limits, and those limits have to be set by the person giving, not the people taking. Chloe showed up late in the afternoon, when the crowd had thinned out and only the inner circle remained. She had brought a small potted snake plant as a grand opening gift, a resilient indoor plant that takes forever to grow but survives almost anything. Abigail greeted her with a hug. It was the first time they had embraced since long before all of this chaos started. They caught up while putting away the leftover cocktail glasses and folding the high-top table linens. Chloe mentioned she had gotten a promotion at her part-time office job, a little more responsibility and a slight pay bump. She proudly shared that her GPA for her first semester was well above average. She talked about the new friends she had made on campus, girls she went out with on the weekends to places that cost next to nothing, a city park, a local plaza, hanging out at someone's apartment. She also mentioned that her mom had asked about Abigail a few times over the last couple of months. Not demanding anything, just genuinely asking how she was doing and if there was any news. Abigail told her she was doing really well. And she said it with a simplicity that she herself realized was completely true. Chloe asked, carefully, choosing her words with the caution of someone who has learned that certain questions require a gentle touch, if Abigail thought things might ever heal with the family. Abigail thought about it before answering. She said the word heal might be the wrong word, because what existed before wasn't healthy for anyone, it only functioned because she had been holding the entire structure up on her own back. She said there was room to build something entirely new. Something more honest. Something balanced, where every single person carried their own weight without expecting someone else to solve their problems for them. She admitted she didn't know how or when that would happen. But she was open to the possibility, provided that openness was met with consistent action over time, not just a good apology on a sidewalk. Chloe nodded, like someone who was actually listening to comprehend, not just waiting for her turn to speak. When her niece finally left and Abigail was left completely alone in her massive, expanded studio for the first time after the chaos of the event, she walked slowly through the new wing. She ran her fingertips over the spotless cutting tables, checked the machines that still smelled like factory oil, and stopped at the massive front window looking out onto the street illuminated by the late afternoon sun. She felt a strange, deeply satisfying sensation in that moment, a sense of belonging that required zero external validation. She had built this empire. She had built everything inside it: the reputation, the vendor contracts, the professional relationships, the absolute trust her clients placed in her hands. She had achieved all of this while simultaneously bankrolling an entire family structure with her profits. And when she finally stopped holding that structure up, she hadn't collapsed. She kept standing, because the people who relied on her were finally forced to figure out how to stand on their own 2 feet. Abigail had learned this lesson the absolute hardest way possible. She had learned that endless generosity mutates into expectation. That expectation morphs into entitlement. And that entitlement breeds deep, toxic resentment on both sides, the person demanding the help, and the person feeling extorted to give it. She had learned that a love you have to buy on the first of every month isn't love. It's rent. And absolutely nobody deserves to pay rent for the right to have a family. She had a massive, thriving business now. She had a niece she could exchange honest, real texts with. She had the fragile but very real possibility of a family that was finally learning, at their own pace and the hard way, that healthy relationships require mutual respect, not financial dependency. And most importantly, she had the peace of a woman who had finally learned how to take care of herself, without needing a single person's permission to do so. Now, if you enjoyed this story, click subscribe, and tell me in the comments, which part made your jaw drop. Oh, and don't forget to become a member to get access to exclusive videos I don't post here. See you there.